and welcome to Insights in Focus podcast. My name is Pamela Hellig. I'm an actuarial manager at Insight Life Solutions, and today I'm joined by Nalen Naidoo. Now, we have a special episode of the podcast today. We're doing an open books podcast, which means we're getting to know someone fascinating and well-respected in the industry based on the books they've read and loved. So Nalen may need no introduction to many of our audience, but for those who aren't familiar with him, Nalen is a highly respected actuary in the South African actuarial world, and he spent his first 17 years of his career in various insurance roles before moving to Naspers 2 years ago to head up the Property 24 business. So he's finding new ways to apply actuarial and leadership skills to property and cars online classified industries. He also holds various leadership positions in board structures and is the chair of the ASSA Education Board, chair of the ASSA Transformation Committee, and is ASSA President-Elect. Welcome, Nalen.
Thank you, Pamela. Wonderful to be here.
Great. Now tell me, are you a reader?
Very much so.
Good, because like we said, on this podcast, we will talk about you, get to know you, and what you're busy with, what you're passionate about, but through the lens of books that you've read and loved. So think of it as desert island discs for bibliophiles.
Brilliant. Yeah.
But let's get started with a bit about you. And I think what everyone would love to know is, how does an actuary get into Property 24? So tell me a bit about your career leading up to that and then the transition to your current role.
Yeah, sure, Pamela. Thanks. So I've had mainly traditional actuarial roles my whole career. I started off as an actuarial specialist at Old Mutual, doing valuations and pricing type of work. I was doing most of the work outside of South Africa, so doing work in Kenya, Malawi, Namibia. And that sort of introduced a whole new flavor to the type of work I was doing, because there weren't many actuaries working in those countries. And that increased my exposure then to different parts of the business. I still kept it very traditional though. So I can't, that's definitely been a case. After that, after I got married, my wife and I felt it was a good idea to spend a bit of time abroad. And so we moved to the UK, and with Aviva, I spent time in London, and then also with Aviva in Chicago and then in Singapore. And all the work in that part of my career was capital, financial reporting, capital management, technical work. I think the work was wonderful because of the cultural diversity and learning new things and seeing new parts of the world, but it was technical actuarial work. First role I had that maybe branched it outside, a little bit more outside, was the capital job I had in Singapore. That was still technical concepts, but a little bit more of a business focus in the risk function of Aviva Asia's regional office. And that gave me a different sort of exposure to the different businesses. It was all a regional job. My wife and I then decided to come back to Cape Town or back to South Africa. And about 11 years ago, we moved back and I joined Liberty. And at Liberty, I had what would probably be regarded as first more commercial role, which was the head of reinsurance. And so still technical actuarial concepts, but much more commercial engagements with reinsurance partners. And then it went from there into risk management and into people management and the actuarial development program that Liberty had, which was like a career management office, quite a wide range of things. But what happened in the last 5 years of my time at Liberty was various changes that were going on within the business meant that some of the fintech and insurtech assets and investments that the company had made over time needed someone to look after them. And I was fortunate enough to have some of those assets into my world. And so business agility, agile thinking, innovation, design thinking, and then of course the tech elements became a much bigger part of my job. And that's probably where the start of the sort of more common ground in my current role actually started. I spent a lot of time in distribution at Liberty, which also gives me sales exposure, which was also important for the current role. And so 2 years ago, an opportunity arose to spend some time now in my current role, which was the head of Property 24. It at first appeared quite daunting. It was an extremely long process to decide that this was the right role, given the change, the wide change. But the similarities and some of the progression, the innovation, the tech, there was a lot of commonality. And so it was a bit of a risk, a bit of a leap. I do describe it to people as a leap of faith, because you never know how it's going to work. And I'm very grateful that Naspers and also made the leap of faith at taking a bit of a chance outside of what they would regard as more traditional business managers. And so far, it's been fun. It's been a fantastic 2 years in this role.
Okay, amazing. Now, it's almost time to talk about the first book you've brought. But before we do, I'd like to find out about your reading habits a little bit more. So have you always loved reading, or where did your love of reading start?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first, so we grew up with books as children and always being read to and then reading to others. And my first memory of some of the books that we read were actually me by reciting them back to my parents, very, very young ages, where you don't actually read, you're just reciting the words to the people around you. And thank goodness I actually have some of those books still. My mom kept them from a little important memento.
You didn't bring one today?
Didn't bring it today. They're all back in KZN. Sort of golden books and Richard Scarry books.
Yes. Oh gosh,
absolutely beautiful little. So anyway, that's pretty much where it all started. And look, reading for me, it's taken cycles. So a lot of reading at school. When I got to campus, to be honest, there wasn't much time. And actuarial studies, I didn't really read much. There was a gap. When we moved abroad, public transports meant there was a lot more time again. So then I read a lot. When the kids were born, less time. And actually it was lockdown that really kicked off another wave. So I've had, like the last 4 or 5 years, another busy wave of reading. So for me, it's been a bit cyclical.
Okay, and you have 3 young boys?
3 young boys that allow me to read in any noise level environment.
Okay.
I've now got the skill to to read regardless of what's going on around me.
And do they love reading as well?
They do. So I'm extremely proud of all of them. My eldest can devour books. One of the books I'm currently reading actually is a book he read recently and recommended to me.
Okay.
He's almost 10 and he just devours books. And my 7-year-old has, it's actually phenomenal to watch him read, because he's made that transition from, just barely being able to put the words together to now fluent reading, and he can read full story to you. It's absolutely wonderful being read to. And then of course our baby is as well. He's 4. He's almost 4, and he's really picked up the baton really well. And so we're proud of them, because reading is such an important part of the household. My wife reads a lot as well, so it's a part of the house.
I actually read, or I saw a headline the other day, it could just be clickbait, but apparently the best predictor of academic success in children is, whether their parents read to them from very small. So
sure, that sounds right. I don't think it's clickbait. I think that's pretty right.
Something to it. So tell me about the first book that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, definitely. So the first one I actually don't have here to show you.
Okay.
It's out on loan with a family member.
Name and shame.
Yeah. It's actually called Why We Sleep, and it's by Matthew Walker. Now, this was first introduced to me by a colleague in 2017, 2018. During this time, it was the height of my travels to Joburg. I was traveling about half the week every week, and it was always early morning flights, late evening flights. Sleep definitely was the one thing that I was very happy to sacrifice at that stage of my career. And it took me another 3 years or so before I finally bought the book. So it was lockdown, being at home in a different sort of calm environment, and I said, okay, I'm actually going to get it. So I bought it from Take-A-Lot in 2020 and read it very quickly. It was extremely easy to read, data-driven, but the premise behind it is, I don't think we actually realize just how important this part of our lives are. And it's we live in a society where it's actually acceptable to, that's the one thing you skimp on. Okay, eating as well, but sleep and eat. I mean, people just are very happy to sacrifice. But the long-term impacts of doing so are quite astounding. One of the things the book talks about is how sleep is actually, from an evolutionary perspective, one of the strangest concepts, because there you are out in the wild, completely vulnerable for 8 hours a night in the dark.
Yeah.
And almost every animal, I think it might be every animal, every organism does it. There's a period that they enter called sleep. And it's because of the healing and restorative nature and all that other stuff that's so important. So sleep for me is now extremely important, and I prioritize that over most things. And the book also has really helpful guides on sort of what good sleep quality is and what can lead to bad sleep quality. And it changes then, actually has changed my nighttime routine and what I get up to, in the sort of 2-3 hours.
So what are some of the changes you've made?
So I think the one is probably obvious, but about caffeine in the time of day that you consume caffeine, and actually what caffeine does to your body in terms of the sleep hormone and how it can mess up with the sleep hormone. I think other changes are things like alcohol and how much alcohol you consume before sleeping, because that impacts the quality as well. Screen time, so we've heard about that, the amount of screen time you have before you fall asleep, and therefore, if you're going to read or do something more relaxing. I think some of those changes were, sort of reasonably easy to make, but others are harder. I mean, life takes you to various places and you are doing things that you can't quite, can't control all the time. And so for me, it's actually been just more about cognizant about it, that there's this thing here, and it's no longer something to take for granted, actually. So yeah.
Does everyone need 8 hours?
So not according to the book. It does depend very much on where you are, and it is age dependent as well. And so I think it's a good marker. So it's a very good sort of assessment of whether you're there, whether you're in that right ballpark. I think the what the book does help you understand a little bit more is the different stages of sleep and how it progresses through the night. And so the length is important, but also, sort of the disruptions you generally have through the night. Everyone has disruptions that, we live in the cities, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's always disruption. But there are certain stages at which your brain is really recovering, and it actually is very helpful for it not to be too disturbed. And actually what I realized was a lot of the flights that I was taking in those early mornings required me to wake up right in the middle of that important period. And so, it does depend on when you go to sleep and how long, there's a lot of dependencies here, but knowing that can at least help you adjust. You can't stop taking early flights. We live in worlds where, you can't, but at least you can be aware of that phase and then try and plan your sleep so that at least you've got it before you need to wake up.
And do you think there's potential for application to insurance underwriting? Some of the Insight guys did some research on that a few years ago.
Great question. So at the time it was recommended to me in 2017, 2018, it was actually part of a work sort of wellness conversation, but it wasn't for employees, it was actually for customers. And there was a lot of research at the time just about how important sleep is, and if you could track it in a reliable way, could that not be something that then could feed into either an ongoing health management program like a rewards program, or could it be fed into insurance products and fed in to help people be incentivized almost to sleep?
Yeah.
The tracking behind it can be a little bit tricky. The quality measures, also a little bit tricky. I think most of the studies, certainly in the book, and it is a reasonably old book now, so I'm sure the tech has moved on, but a lot of it, to get accurate readings, requires you to actually have stuff attached to your head, and
Okay.
So you're under monitoring. It's not quite the same as the little detector on your wrist.
Okay.
And so I think to get accurate for the purposes of maybe underwriting and insurance purposes, I think you need a risk tolerance somewhere there. But to get 80% of the way there, to vastly improve people's lives, yeah, definitely. I mean, there you can definitely make it something that people feel they need to fix.
Okay. And do you have a favorite quote from the book?
I do.
Yes, when you prepared earlier.
I did actually get this. I knew you were going to ask me the quote question, so I had to. Yeah, so I really like this one. He says, "Sleep is the greatest legal performance-enhancing drug that most people are probably neglecting."
Okay. Speaking of drugs, I've heard the phrase that dreaming is basically going on a shrooms trip or an acid trip for 8 hours a night and waking up. So.
And I think clearly the science bears it out.
Yeah, maybe we can have some nice things.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So, now that you're getting enough sleep and you're in charge of Property 24, tell me, what are some of the things that you're busy with there at the moment?
Yeah, it's been a good month, so it's been a good start to the year. But generally, what we do in the first couple of months is strat planning, so strategy planning, and so that's what we've been prepping for and coming up and spending a lot of time thinking about the next 3 to 5 years. Specifically, we're thinking about what it means to deepen our property classifieds vertical. So what can we do to become more entrenched within property sector in South Africa?
Mm-hmm.
But then we're also exploring more further out there opportunities like generative AI applications to online classifieds businesses.
Okay.
So that conversation, I think, is quite a really interesting one to try and get our heads around.
What does that look like?
Well, so I think that's the big question. That's the big exploratory question. I think when generative AI and large language models first came out, there was a massive conversation around disrupting search and changing the way people engage with such tools. And so all the big search engines started incorporating then these large language models into them to make it easier for people to use. But it's not clear yet whether the evidence, so there's not enough evidence to show that actually consumer preferences are changing in terms of how they search for core parts of their lives. So property is big, cars are big, and insurance products are big parts of people's, insurance and health products are big parts of people's lives. And it's not really clear right now that they are relying on large language models to give them a different sort of experience there. So the jury is still out, I think, on natural language search.
Okay.
However, as an enabler, and I think this is where the biggest applications are, so productivity enablers. Whether you enable customers and B2B businesses like ours, whether you enable employees within the companies, I think there's very interesting applications there. The early evidence does seem to suggest that the fears around replacing jobs, so blue collar jobs, are not quite as dramatic as perhaps they were first communicated. Actually, it seems to be right now much more about productivity enhancement within more skilled jobs. And so we're seeing interesting applications in marketing, interesting applications in technology, the IT sectors, and in very interesting applications then in how customers can potentially use these tools. Estate agents can use these tools to become more productive themselves. So early days, but that's sort of roughly where the landscape seems to be landing.
Okay, and has the advent of a service like Property 24 and AI and enhanced productivity, what has it done to the relationship between estate agents and their customers?
Yeah, so very little very little has changed at the moment, and I think it's first there's an adoption conversation here around how both the consumer, so the person actually buying and selling property, has adopted these technologies, and then secondly, then how the estate agent interacts with that consumer.
Yeah.
And so, it's a three-party process here. And so adoption has been reasonably slow. But saying that, it's also been quite early in terms of the products and services that we have put out that use this technology. And we're still very experimental and very early stage in many of the things.
So there's still room for estate agents in the
Definitely. There is no under no circumstance, it's such an important property and insurance and healthcare alike, and just such important big decisions that most people want access to a human being to be able to talk through their options, and that we see that across different industries.
And I guess no matter how good a VR headset is or a video of a property, you still want someone to show it to you.
Exactly. And you still want to see it in person.
Yeah.
I think off plan is one thing, but when it exists, you want to see it.
Yeah. So tell me, what's the second book you brought today?
Second book, okay. So the second book I want to talk about is, and this I have brought, so this is called Factfulness, and this is by Hans Rosling. This was first introduced to many of us, actually, in 2018 by the Liberty CEO at the time. And it is a reasonably old book, it's 20 years old, I think now. But the introduction was quite fantastic, and it was as part of a broader leadership rollout as well. So it was incorporated into many of our leadership interventions and training discussions. It took me, again, a couple of years to actually get the book. I think I only got it in 2022. Also bought it online, bought it on Take-A-Lot. And the reason this book is fascinating is it just reminds you how much of your world is influenced by the perceptions of others around you and by what you read in either social media or in traditional news media. It's a complete, you're extremely swayed by what you see. But when you actually look to get the data, that changes everything. Your perception of whether things are improving, your perception of whether things are deteriorating, everything is actually data-driven. And I think what happens is we spend lots of time in these social media bubbles or in these media circles where there's a lot of negativity, and there's a pressing fear. There's almost like an imminent danger feeling to a lot of the conversations. But this book helps you realize that actually most of us are wrong about the world in its entirety. And I thought that was great. So, and I think anybody who works with data, could benefit from just being reminded that this is something, we are data-driven people. And so let's get the data.
So before thinking that things are so bad, actually look at the data.
Exactly.
Do you think South Africans are particularly guilty of this?
So interestingly, the author does talk about the tests he has run. So he has a quiz, and that's the basis. That's a sort of fundamental basis of a lot of the book, which is a quiz about the state of the world. So, okay. Do you think childhood mortality has? And he gives you three options, or he says the number of or the proportion of females finishing high school now versus 50 years ago. He's got sort of indicators like that, and it's quite a long. It's how many questions there on the quiz? Definitely about a dozen so questions, and his analysis of it is basically every single country he goes to gets less than, I think, 3 out of that full number. I think it's 12 or 13 or something like that. Correct. And there are many countries where the entire groups that he works with will be getting nothing right, and it's all their perception. It's all just perception based. So are South Africans more negative? Not according to the facts, not according to the data. Yeah, let's look at the data. It does not appear so. But of course, I mean, we do hear lots in our circles.
Okay. So is it an uplifting read, would you say?
I think so. I mean, for me, the first bits, when the first realization hits you, that's probably the biggest wake-up call. And then the rest of the book is just sort of reminding you about the wake-up call you had. But definitely very, very interesting.
I mean, I know this podcast isn't about me, but that's why I find many nonfiction books they tell you the idea in the first paragraph and the rest of the book is anecdotes and kind of regurgitating the idea, which is why I'm more of a fiction reader myself. But enough about me. Do you have a favorite quote from the book?
Yeah, I do. So this one, actually, two quotes. This one here I want to talk about. So, and it's a little bit related to what we've already said. But every group of people I ask, and this is from the author, every group of people I ask thinks the world is more frightening, more violent, and more hopeless. In short, more dramatic than it really is. And that's a global comment. And then the next quote that he said, and I think this maybe speaks more to your question about the South African condition. Remember, things can be bad and getting better. And I think that for me is really, I mean, that sort of sums it up. I think most of us stop at the first bit, and we don't see the improvements around us.
Yeah, both things can be true.
Exactly.
So do you tend to read fiction or nonfiction? What genres do you like to read?
Sure, wide range of genres. The books I brought today are all nonfiction. They happen to be nonfiction. But my favorite fictional genres are historical fiction.
Okay.
I really love reading about stuff that happened hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
But I do have a wide range of other fictional genres at home, and all the nonfiction genres mainly around leadership and business. That's quite interesting.
And leadership is one of the things you're passionate about, right?
Definitely. I mean, I think it started at a very young age at school with the leadership positions at school, and it just carried on through university, and then any opportunity at work, and carrying on now into some of these positions. And it really, the words around it eluded me until a course we did when I was at Liberty with Standard Bank. And that was the first time I was introduced to the concepts of servant leadership. This was in 2016, 2017. And those principles of servant leadership, actually, they really resonated with me around, I mean, there's 10 principles, but, things around empathy and listening and building other people up. It was just so much about it just made sense to me. And so, those principles in particular.
What is servant leadership in a nutshell?
Yeah, so it basically is that it's effectively putting the people around you first, and focusing on their growth and development, and focusing on them becoming better, and the skills required to do that, which involve empathy, which involve listening. I've drawn a blank on some of the other principles, but the wide range of skills you would need to do that effectively make you that sort of leader. It changes a lot of the way of leading, from much more sort of autocratic styles to much more collaborative styles. It emphasizes the leader's role from behind, not from the front. And not to say there mustn't be direction and clear purpose and plans and timeline. All of that remains. It's more the approach to all the good stuff that we know we need to have in place.
Creating psychological safety.
Exactly. Yeah.
What's the third book you have?
Yeah. So the third one is a very different book. So this is called Autobiography of a Yogi.
Okay.
And it's by someone called Parmahansa Yogananda. Now this book, it's a heavy book. It's at the intersection of, I would say, various religions and spirituality, broader spiritual concepts. It took me a year to read this book. And I read a few pages every night because it was that dense. I found it was that dense, and the concepts were that sort of important to me that I couldn't manage more than a few pages every night. So it took about a year to read. And this was actually gifted to me at the beginning of 2023. So that's where it came from. And it explores quite core beliefs around how people are connected to one another, and actually what being part of society really means. It also talks at one level about from a religious perspective and spiritual, the existence of a greater being, but then also how people engage with that concept and how they become, how they are able to almost free themselves from some of the more sort of materialistic sort of tendencies that most of us sort of aspire to, which I still do. I'm not saying, materialistic tendencies are bad, but it does help you get a different perspective on them. And so this, it is an autobiography. So it is this particular person's life, and it was written about his life up until about the mid-1950s.
Okay.
So it is actually it's a very old book. The reason it was gifted to me was this is the book that Steve Jobs read every year before his passing. And he got as many people around him to read it. And so when I took on my tech leadership job, one of my friends thought this was a good idea for me to pick up. And I can understand why. It does make you appreciate differently the way the world is connected. So yeah, it is and it is heavy, right? So and when I say it's heavy, it deals with concepts that you have to be in the right mindset. And I happen to be in the right mindset. I don't think if I received this book in 2022 or 2021, it would have landed. And I think it's therefore, if you're on some sort of journey, if you are more interested in spirituality, then this is probably something that can help unlock some of that thinking.
So with a heavy book like this, how do you digest it? Do you have a discipline where you read a little bit at a time and reflect? Do you write things down? How do you make sure you get the most of these books?
Yeah, that is a good question. So I don't write things down, and I think it would be, well, I keep little notes on an app just for interest, but I don't actually properly write things down. What I found most helpful is actually talking about some of the stuff, so especially when it's very, very complicated or to me anyway, I find very complicated concepts. So reading a couple of pages, trying to ingest what is going on, and actually just talking about it. And obviously talking about it with the right-minded people, and, or it doesn't have to be even like-minded. It's just people that you can bounce ideas off. That sort of helps things land. I think you could probably, given the number of references to different religious texts in this book and the way it's been written, I think you could spend, as Steve Jobs did, his whole life reading it.
Okay.
And you still get something new every time you read it. And so it's definitely not a one and.
So if you're comfortable sharing, who are some of the people that you have these discussions with? Or perhaps another question, who do you take your reading recommendations from?
Yeah, okay. So that's a good one. So reading recommendations generally come from the circle around me. So when it's nonfiction. So nonfiction books come from recommendations from close people and business colleagues as well. Fiction is a little bit simpler. Fiction, we have a market in our suburb every month.
Okay.
And I go to that park, and I go to that market, and there's a secondhand book table, and that's where I buy as many secondhand books as I can possibly find that are interesting, and that's how I choose the fictional books. But the non-fictional books definitely by recommendation. Your question about who to talk to, I think it's a wide range. I think it depends on what the topic is, actually. Okay. There are definitely a few actuaries that and I am very close friends with many actuaries from my university, and so they form a core part of my circle of talking about things.
Trauma bonding.
Yes, exactly. It is trauma bonding. Yes.
Yeah.
But many people that wide qualifications and wide range of different experiences, I think, just add to some of these conversations.
Okay, and you say this book you read around the time of transitioning in your career, right?
Yeah.
And how have you found being an actuary in your new role? What actuarial skills have you managed to bring to the table, if any?